Hi, I'm Kalvin Pugh, and this is HIV Connect, a podcast from the International Association of Providers of AIDS Care, or IAPAC, that brings into focus what living with HIV looks like today. In each episode, I connect with clinicians, experts, and community leaders in conversations about clinical and psychosocial management issues such as aging, stigma, and sexual health topics that matter to people living with HIV. Today's episode is all about long-term thriving and aging with HIV. My guests today are Dr. Jonathon Applebaum, an internist, geriatrician, and HIV specialist. He's the education director and professor of internal medicine at Florida State University, where he also serves as the chair of the Department of Clinical Sciences. He is on the board of directors of Health HIV and has previously worked with the HIV and Aging Treatment Consensus Project, HIV-age.org, and the American Academy of HIV Medicine. Dr. Applebaum has made efforts to serve diverse and underserved populations across America, including those at Fenway Community Health, at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and at CarePoint Health and Wellness in Tallahassee, and Tez Anderson, who's been living with HIV since 1983. He coined and defined the term AIDS survivor syndrome to describe the psychosocial ramifications of living in the aftermath of the early AIDS pandemic. He's the founder of the Long-Term Survivors Awareness Day and Let's Kick Ass AIDS Survivor Syndrome, a nonprofit empowering HIV long-term survivors to thrive. Tez currently serves as a U=U ambassador, and he has served in numerous capacities, including reporter for the Gay Cable News Network, AIDS United's HIV and Aging Policy Action Coalition, ANAC's HIV and Aging Expert Advisory Committee, and the Ribbon Organizing Center for HIV. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. So, my first question for you is, why is the topic of aging with HIV so important for us to discuss today?
I guess I can start off with saying that, all you have to do is look at the demographics of HIV in the United States now. More than half of all persons living with HIV now are over the age of 50, and projections are at the end of this decade, which would be when the targets for end the epidemic will be there, that probably over half of the population living with HIV will be at the age of 60 or older.
I would add to that. Yes, it's true that the majority of people with HIV in the U.S. and in most Western developed countries are over the age of 50. And in my experience, we're approaching 60 pretty fast. I mean, it seems like Let's Kick Ass is 10 years old this year. And when I started doing this, no one was talking about HIV and aging. So the reason it's important for us to discuss it is because, honest to God, we don't have the luxury of time. I hear about people almost every day, that have died of a heart attack or of a stroke or of something that's, quote, not age-related, but it's related to the inflammation that they have in their bodies. And I think for long-term survivors especially, which is a distinction I want to make, I've been living with HIV this year is going to be 40 years. So the inflammation that affected my body back in the days when there were no treatments or there were bad treatments has taken a toll on my body. So it's like dog years. If you're 64 or 63 and HIV years, you're 75. I mean, it's like it adds time to your age. You age faster.
Yeah, I'll kind of add on to that, Tez, and just say that the issue as a geriatrician and HIV doc is that it seems that folks living with HIV actually seem to age a bit earlier. So you take HIV, you take aging, and you take the normal diseases that older people get, and you have a mixture we call multimorbidity that really impacts the approach to care and the kind of care that we as providers need to be giving to this population.
I think it's interesting that both of you touched on that. And maybe you can add some more light to this. So how does HIV affect us as we age? And, for example, is it true that, like you've already stated, that HIV accelerates the aging process?
I'll tell you that's been controversial. But I think that the evidence, at least as I interpret it, is that it seems to be more towards the fact that HIV tends to age people faster. and as I alluded to before, and I think as Tez has mentioned, is that it's the chronic inflammation that we see that probably is the culprit, although that's not 100% definite. And that even people who are well controlled with the newer medications and have an undetectable viral load, there is still ongoing inflammation going on. And we know from other chronic diseases where inflammation is ongoing despite control, that those populations, and I'm talking about folks who don't have HIV, but may have other chronic inflammatory diseases, they tend to develop complications of aging earlier also.
There was a study released in, I think it was December or November, that showed that people are aging they say 5 years faster. The flaw in this study, if you ask me, was they just said people who are HIV positive for 10 years. They didn't just delineate between lengths of time of having HIV, of living with HIV. And that's, again, where long-term survivors become sort of a separate cohort in my mind. There's a lot of overlap, but the distinctions between living with HIV for, say, 30 or 40 years, as opposed to 5 years or 6 years or 10 years, is pretty substantial given how medications are much better now. I don't know that people who are long-term survivors, I think our aging path will be different than people who come after us. Um, that's kind of why we're a dying breed. We're the canaries in the coal mine. We're the first ones to get it, first ones to live with it longest. There will not be another generation like ours.
And I agree. I think that you're talking about different populations, because if you look at the long-term survivors, the people that developed HIV in the 80s and 90s, before we had the current, types of medications, they often had much far along disease. They had higher viral loads, much lower CD4 counts, all of which we know wreaks havoc on the body. So I do think you're right. I think the cohort we're seeing now who, may have had HIV for 10 years may actually have a different longevity profile, longevity pathway than folks who are long-term survivors from the 80s and 90s.
I was just going to say, the people I know that are coming down with heart attacks lately is just astounding to me. And there are people who've had HIV for 25 and 35 and, like myself, 40 years. And I think that has to do with the fact that the toll that HIV took on our bodies before treatment and the inflammation from that was enormous, and untreated, it really is wreaking a havoc on us.
So kind of in line with what you just said there, Tez. So what is the effect of HIV on other age-related conditions such as heart disease and osteoporosis?
I mean, almost everyone that I know, and I deal mostly with, as I said before, long-term survivors, whom I consider pre-heart, who had access to no medications or bad medications. I think they're having all those issues: osteoarthritis, high blood pressure, high everything. And we're seeing aging in that population, at least anecdotally. I don't have studies on this. It's one of the failures of our current situation is we don't have enough studies on the effects of HIV on long-term survivors. We have it on HIV and aging now in spades. That wasn't true 10 years ago. There was nothing. But the world has caught up with us. I think like John said before, it's about, the numbers of people who are aging with HIV now. It's just, you can't overlook us for that long. Do you have something you wanted to add, John?
Well, I guess the only other thing I would add is that, the research, and I'm going to kind of expand upon what you said, Tez, is that if you look at a lot of the clinical trials that were done, particularly around pharmaceuticals, older persons with HIV were often excluded from those trials for reasons that I think were a little obscure and probably very short-sighted. And now we're playing catch-up as population ages. It's almost like putting up fire retardant material in the middle of a fire kind of thing. And so there's so much out there that we really don't yet know about what happens with someone who has been living with HIV for a while, and the aging process.
I mean, it seems like there's a lot that we still need to discover in this space, and looking forward to what may come down the pipeline. But what can individuals do now to facilitate aging healthy with HIV? Things like smoking cessation, physical activity, or mental health services.
So I agree. I think lifestyle, at any time. I mean, and we counsel even our patients who have other diseases besides HIV, that it's never too late to embrace a healthy lifestyle. But certainly, the earlier you do it, the better. Smoking in any context is really bad, but it's particularly bad with folks living with HIV. The data out there around smoking in persons who are living with HIV is just astounding as far as the increased risk and the number of life years lost just because they smoke. For all of my patients, when I first meet them and if they continue to smoke afterwards, I constantly talk to them about the importance. If there's one thing that they can do to prolong their life, is to try to stop smoking. That's one thing. I mean, obviously exercise, proper diet, rest, stress reduction, mental health issues. Hopefully we'll touch upon that during this podcast. I think are really, really important.
Everything he said. I mean, honestly, I can't really add to that too much, except for the fact that, especially the LGBT, maybe just gay men, let's just leave it at gay men, seem to smoke a lot. It seems to be part of our culture. There was a campaign by Philip Morris in the 70s who did a thing called Project Scum that was targeting gay men in urban situations. I forget the acronym for SCUM, but it's something about urban smoking. That's been prevalent. I mean, the Marlboro Man was invented to attract gay men to smoke. And it's become a sexy thing. And so there's a lot of people in the community that still smoke. And if we could just get them to stop that, that'd be a big deal. But as you said, rest and especially sleep, getting enough sleep, getting into healthy foods, knowing what healthy foods are, not fad diet. All of those things are important. And I think the connections that we make are also important, connecting with each other and feeling less alone, because the stress of the mental health issues that we will address momentarily has taken a toll on our bodies too. And they continue to. I read somewhere that isolation among older people is like smoking, 10 packs of cigarettes a day or something ridiculous. A huge number of people have stress from being so isolated, to be so alone. And that takes a toll on your physical body too.
Yeah, I'll add that the data on social isolation, which is fairly recent and ongoing, is also very provocative. And it really talks about the need that we as humans are social animals, and that loneliness is an additional stress on a body. And so if you have HIV and other, comorbidities, and you add social isolation on top of that, that's detrimental.
I think it's interesting that you both have brought up isolation, because isolation can really have poor mental health effects, especially those with mental illness, especially with everything that we've gone through the last couple of years where we've been forced to separate from our communities. So mental illness, especially depression and anxiety, is common among older adults living with HIV. So, Tez, I'll ask you first, how do you take care of your mental health?
Up and down, I suppose, is the best way to answer it. You asked before at one point about how I maintain a good attitude. It's all over the place, because lately I've been going through a kind of a rough patch, but I'm smiling through it. I don't think we realize how many people are suffering in silence around isolation and those things. I don't think we understand, because people can put on a good face a lot of the time. And until we start asking people, how are you doing? And not the usual, hey, how you doing? Fine. But say, no. I really want to know how you're doing. How is your life? Do you have friends? Can you do the work around your house you need to do? Can you cook for yourself? Do you need help with anything? Most people just want us to say fine and be done with it, because it's a pleasantry. And that's not good enough for older adults. You really want to delve deeper and have them know that you're listening to them.
And then Dr. Applebaum is, in your clinician experience, those things like mental illness and depression, anxiety, how do you suggest, people living with HIV who are aging and maybe isolated really care for their mental health?
That's a great question, and it's so variable from person to person. I think that social support is really important, as we alluded to before. So I think that's the first thing. So having a peer group, whether it be their family of choice or friends or whatever, is really important. Support groups still play a big role, and obviously consulting mental health professionals. Doesn't necessarily mean they need medication, but certainly a counselor or therapist would be the first step. But evaluating them, I mean, if they're at risk of self-harm, then that's a different a degree of concern that we would deal with immediately. And then also recognize that folks may be reticent to reach out and may try self-medication. So we need to be aware of substance use. A lot of people turn to substances in an attempt to self-medicate because of their depression and or anxiety.
Well, kind of keeping in that same vein, Tez, you're an expert at AIDS survivor syndrome. And I can imagine the toll it really takes on everyone's mental health who really went through those times. As a young gay man, even prior to my own HIV diagnosis, I was told that all my role models had died during the AIDS crisis. And you and I have got to spend some time together the last year, and that's just not true. There are still people out there who lived through those things, who are really great role models for the rest of us. How have you maintained such a healthy outlook with all the losses you've experienced?
I've done it through community, through connecting with people. There's a meme that we lost an entire generation to AIDS. It's one of my least favorite memes because while we lost a lot of the generation, I'm one of the generation that's still here. And so what happens when we have memes like that is that they just discount the whole population that came forward before. And that feels really hard. It's a hard pill to swallow, given the loss and the tragedy of AIDS. I mean, HIV in the early days was like a combination of both amazing connections and fighting for the same cause and feeling like a purpose and meaning. And then the heart drugs came along, and suddenly it was a chronic manageable illness. I put that in air quotes because it may be chronic, but it's not easily managed. And I think that it's like when you find other people and you realize that you're not alone. I mean, our first town hall with Let's Kick Ass was 10 years ago, and it held at the San Francisco LGBT Center. And I thought if we get 40 people, I'll be very happy. And 225 showed up. And it showed me that there were lots of people who had dropped off the radar, just kind of disappeared from the culture because, one, of ageism, but two, because they had lost so many friends that making new friends seemed impossible. Seemed like, why bother? Because I'll just die anyway. And so I think letting people know that they're not alone. And I get a lot of emails from people who say, thank you for bringing this up. Because I coined AIDS survivor syndrome, as you know. And I don't love it when people just leave it at PTSD. Because first of all, PTSD is mislabeled, in my opinion. I think Prince Harry said it the other day. It's STI. So post-traumatic stress injury. Because it really is a wound. And it's normal. It's a normal part of having that much loss at such a young age. So the reasons for us not making friendships is very complicated. But I think the harder we try to do that, the better we do it, the better off we feel physically and mentally. But it's really a tough one because the community, I'll put that politely, but I mean the researchers who do this stuff as a profession, has sort of said, oh, AIDS survivor syndrome is not a real thing. And yeah, I get emails from people all the time saying, thank you. I did not know there was a name for it or that other people were going through it. And I called it AIDS survivor syndrome as a term of empowerment as much as anything to honor the experience we had going through the early epidemic, which is unique to our population.
Dr. Applebaum, if there's someone listening or watching this that maybe went through similar experiences to what Tez has gone through, is there advice you'd give them as a clinician?
Yeah, I think I would agree with what Tez was alluding to, which is reach out to other folks who are similar to them. Some of that may be difficult. If you're practicing, let's say, or you're living in a rural area where there may not be much support, but there's certainly online presence of groups. Reaching out to Tez and his group, even if they're across the country, maybe another option. But I think that sense of community is really important, and to realize that there's other people like you that have gone through or are going through what you're going through, I think will help ease some of the stress and burden.
I also think that telling people it's a perfectly normal response to a traumatic event is very helpful too, because I think people feel like there's something wrong with me because I'm having these feelings. And honest to God, it's just a natural response to a very unnatural experience. And for me, EMDR is a kind of mental health therapy that helped me enormously. It's called a sensitive rapid eye movement. Your eyes go back and forth. And it's a form of therapy that's very effective in the short term. I did 5 sessions of it and felt like a different person. So I think seeking professional help is good, but sometimes in my situation, at least in my situation, I had to explain to the nice therapist who was crying on my shoulder. I was explaining to him something about my life, and I said, "Honey, this is not how this works. You're supposed to be comforting me. I'm not supposed to be comforting you." But I realized in that moment that I knew more about the early days of the epidemic and the things they were treating me for depression and anxiety and sleep disorder and anger and all these things I was having, hopelessness and suicidal ideation. It was an ugly 5-year period. They were treating me for the individual things without understanding what the overarching thing was behind it. And I think that's important, is to look at what causes what.
Yeah, I think, with everything that we've all experienced as a whole planet, the isolation, some of the constant traumas that we've all been induced to by the media and everything else that's happened around the world, that asset of support systems and mental health professionals is pretty vital. But I think, that's one of those things that folks, they know what their own experience better than, someone else is going to, but seeking mental health services has been vital for me to move on past some of the things that we've experienced the last couple of years.
I think all clinicians need to be trained in need to be informed about trauma-informed care, because I don't think anybody doesn't go through life without trauma.
Tez, you actually took the words right out of my mouth. That was what I was going to mention. That, and then also realizing that not all therapists know this, and also not all therapists know about AIDS survivor syndrome either. So it may not be, I always tell people that just like with friends and stuff, they may not click, with them. So you may not click with your first therapist, but I would keep searching and not say, hey, therapy isn't working because of one session or a couple of sessions with one therapist. Maybe find a different therapist who is more in tune to you than the one that you're dealing with now. Because I think mental health services will help.
I think if we could just teach people how to empower themselves and speak up and say to them, this is not working for me and here's why, is useful not only for the clinician who's treating you, but it's useful for you to feel like you have some involvement in your own care.
I think that's kind of been a running theme throughout my years in the HIV space. Is that something I taught, the folks that I worked with, the clients that I worked with, was that you're the CEO. And I think that really applies to all of your care. If you're clinician isn't listening to you, or your nurse practitioner or whoever isn't listening to you, especially when you're talking about something, as delicate as aging with HIV, because you're talking about polypharmacy and you're talking about, the balance of having all of your clinicians all on one page, and I think that's one thing I've tried to really impart to people is that you are the CEO of your care, mental health, clinical health, whatever, and you should hire and fire accordingly.
Good, and that's something we teach our medical students is patient-centered care. The patient is the center of the care, not the doctor, not the hospital, not the healthcare system, but the patient.
I just wish more of them would listen. Because, honestly, I have fired doctors. I fired a very famous AIDS doctor in San Francisco years ago, decades ago, because all he did was complain about how he wasn't making any money. And I was like, I don't really care if you're not making money. I'm here to have my treatment and my health care taken care of. And I was so bitter about it all that I just said, this is not working for me. I'm going to have to change positions. Don't be afraid to fire your doctor.
And I think we have to remember that the privilege of a lot of us in city centers is that we have those options, and not everyone's going to, those folks in rural areas maybe not have all those choices, but hopefully we get to a place someday that is an option for everybody to, be more in charge of the way that their care is managed. Something I'd like to ask you, Dr. Applebaum, which is, as a clinician, when you're aging with HIV, how complex and how important is the issue of polypharmacy?
It's huge. The data from the group in San Francisco, which has done a phenomenal job, is that the average, at least in their cohort, the average person was taking 12 medications. That included their antiretroviral therapy. So if you assume that they're on 3 antiretroviral drugs, and that you subtract that from 12, you get 9. It means they were on 9 other medications. So as a clinician and as a geriatrician, it's one of the first things I look at is, do you need to be on all these drugs? Is there a diagnosis that supports the use of a certain medication? And if not, then the question is, why are you taking it? Do you really need it? So it's something I think more and more primary care docs are attuned to. It's something we're teaching now. Rather than prescribing, we're teaching de-prescribing. And it has to be done carefully. It's not just, you cross off a medication and delete it. Yeah, there has to be a reason, and it has to be carefully thought out. But I think polypharmacy is a huge issue in our population of older persons living with HIV.
Tez, how is then the balance of managing medications as you
It's
age?
tricky. I recently changed HIV regimes for the first time in about 15 years. I'm mostly drug resistant, so I have a very few options. So we decided to, and my physician is pretty good about this, because I went in one day and said, I take a lot of pills. And he said, let's see what we can get rid of. So I was still on prophylaxis for PCP. And even though I had PCP back in 93 or 94, I didn't really need to be on it. My T cells are still low, but mind you, I lived for 7 years with 13 T cells. So I stopped living my life on the a countdown clock used to be how many T cells do you have? And the lower your T cells got, the sooner you're going to die. In my experience, that's not true. I've lived with below the 300 T cells for 25 years. My CD8s are high percentages. But that's in the weeds a bit for people to understand. But I do think it's important that we understand it. But getting rid of those medications that you don't really have to take. Mind you, it's important enough to take a statin probably, and probably something for your cholesterol, for your heart issues if you're aging with it, because it's big. Heart disease is a big killer right now. I've gotten it down some, and I can take everything now at bedtime instead of taking 1 in the morning and 2 at night or something like that. So that's helpful. It's really about quality of life. All the stuff that I'm talking about is really about how do we improve the quality of life? Because for myself, if I'm hooked up on machines and don't know who my husband is or my dog, I tell him, get the gun out. Get rid of me, because I don't want to live that way. Because that's not a good quality of life. And that's the thing that I fight hardest for, is improving our quality of life. And then saying, how many of these medications are really improving our quality of life?
So, Dr. Applebaum, something I'd like to ask you is, considering everything you've experienced over the years as a clinician, what's a piece of advice you'd give young advocates or people who are younger and, they're going to age with HIV? What is something that they should know?
Well, we kind of touched on something called ageism. And so I would encourage the younger folks to understand that they too will age. It's inevitable. And learn from us. The healthy lifestyle thing, as I mentioned right at the very beginning, it's never too late to change your unhealthy habits, but it's sure a heck of a lot better if you do it earlier. And it doesn't mean everyone has to, go to the gym, for 5 hours, five days a week. But, moderate exercise, as we talked about, sleep, eating healthy, avoiding toxic substances, reducing stress, all of those things are important. Much better to start when you're younger.
And avoiding toxic people.
Oh, I'd like a pill for that.
But
how about you, Tez? All the stuff you've experienced over the years, what's a piece of advice you'd give young advocates?
My advice to the advocates are check in with yourself and make sure you're doing what fulfills you. Because I think sometimes I do it myself, slip into a groove, slip into a mode where you're just like, oh, this is what I've been doing. I just keep doing it. But sometimes I have to stop and ask myself, am I really enjoying this? Or am I just doing it because it's what I know how to do? So I think having those challenges of reassessing your life and situation, and I'm not kidding about the toxic friendships. People who are in your life that do not support you, that do not understand you, and if you explain to them what's going on with you and they still don't understand you, they're not worth having in your life. I'd rather be alone than have people who don't understand the reason I'm such a bitch some days. Honestly, my best friends put up with my crap, and I put up with theirs, and I love them anyway, and love them despite that. I can't underestimate how important quality friendships are. Make them young and make them as soon as you can, because it gets harder as you get older to make friends. You're just more naturally isolated, physically compromised. So honestly, it's about doing what feeds your soul. I'm not a big soul person, but in this case, what makes you want to get up in the morning and be excited about what you do?
I think that's so important and such a good note to end on. I want to thank my guests, Dr. Jonathon Applebaum and Tez Anderson, for their insights and expertise on this important conversation. As we in the field of HIV look forward into the future, we really have to be mindful and remember those who came before us and the things that are a part of our history that really have shaped where we are today. And we really have to look to solutions to meet the unique needs and really enhance the quality of life of long-term survivors and those aging with HIV. Thank you so much for joining me today. HIV Connect is made possible through educational grants from Gilead Sciences and Merck & Company, which has no influence over the podcast series topics, content, or speaker selection. To learn more about today's topics and other subjects, visit AIDSinfoNet at www.iaapac.org/support/AIDS-Infonet, or click the link in the show notes. As IAPAC's Senior Advisor on Community Engagement, I want to hear from you. You can email me at kpugh@iapac.org. You can also find out more about today's guests in our show notes. Until next time, please be kind and take care of yourself and each other.